The Germanic Baroque in Quantz. Now let's talk about what was happening in German-speaking lands in the first half of the 18th century, along with the life of Quantz. The Baroque flute owes a thank you to Handel because right before he left to London from Germany, he wrote one of the very first Baroque flute pieces, the D major Sonata, catalog number 378. He wrote it around the same time the biggest 18th century flute star started his practice. Johann Quantz, at the age of 10, after the death of his father, he moved in with his uncle, a town musician. His uncle, however, ends up dying only a few months after Quantz's arrival in Meersburg. Starting as a violinist, Quantz begins an apprenticeship, learning almost all the instruments of his time. He also took lessons in composition. At 16, Quantz finishes his apprenticeship and became a town musician. Town musicians in Quantz's time held secure posts, as long as they weren't Jewish or had a criminal record. There were still court positions, but usually the musicians would be laid off at a court's slightest financial instability. However, their pay was better than a town musician like Quantz. In 1714, Quantz went to Dresden, a city that attracted Bach, Handel, Vivaldi, and Telemann. Some of the best musicians in the world were there, and by 1717, Quantz was playing oboe for the town's so-called Polish band. It was around this time that big-named German composers started to add to the flute's repertoire. Both German and English composers drew inspiration for the flute from Italian vocal and violin music rather than the posh French way of playing. In 1717, Johann Mattheson composed Der Brauchbar Virtuoso, the first pieces for the solo Baroque flute. In 1718, Telemann published music for the Baroque flute for the first time in Germany. One instrumental practice that Quantz was not immune from was that musicians began specializing in a single instrument rather than being a general wind musician. Quantz then starts to shift his focus on the flute, as the oboe hadn't much room for advancement. Many flutists of that time were former oboists. He took 4 months of flute lessons from Buffardine, the principal flutist of the Hofkapelle, the best musical ensemble in Europe at the time. Around 1720 or so, Bach wrote for the first time for the flute in his Brandenburg Concerto 5. Starting in 1722, Quantz still holds his post but travels, performs, and hears performances all throughout Europe. While he was in Paris, he added his famous second right-hand pinky key to differentiate between D sharp and E flat. In 1727, Dresden summoned him back, but he didn't return before a trip to England lasting until June 1727. By the 1730s, we start seeing more amateur music in Germany. They really liked playing opera arrangements and easy keys, while the Dresden flute virtuosi do the opposite, showing off fast music and more difficult keys. The flute also starts to be used in the opera setting in Germany in the 1730s. It is in 1733 that we get Telemann's Fantasias for solo flute. He wrote several other works, and some were even played by Blavet in France. But back to our Quantz saga. In 1740, Quantz is granted permission to twice a year give flute lessons to the Crown Prince Frederick, whose father really didn't approve of his son's musical tastes. But by 1740, Frederick becomes King of Prussia, and he offers Quantz a salary of 2,000 thalers a year plus benefits, a huge salary. To give you an idea, Frederick's own doctor received 1332 thalers, while Quantz made 7 times the amount of CPE Bach, the court accompanist. At 7 p.m. every night, there was a private chamber concert with compositions by Quantz and the King, accompanied by C.P.E. Bach at the keyboard. Flutes that Quantz built had a tuning slide that extended about half a centimeter, and also they were made with different sized middle joints. The wear on the existing Quantz flutes that have been found all suggest flutists were using the longest middle piece the most often, meaning A equals 390 for Quantz. Another notable thing about Quantz is that the bore was larger and tapered more dramatically. Also, instead of being circular, the head joint's blowhole is elliptical. Most flute compositions of the time written for virtuosi by virtuosi were kept in manuscript form, meaning unpublished and undistributed. Astonishingly, none of J.S. Bach's flute sonatas are published until the 19th century. Finally, in 1752, Quantz published his famous essay on playing the flute in German and French. Although his essay went out of fashion rather quickly, it was published and republished several times throughout all of Europe. With his essays and his pupils, Quantz had established the very first school of thinking for the flute. He influenced how composers of his time wrote for the flute, and it wasn't until Quantz that people really had one-on-one flute teachers like we have today. In the next video, we will be discussing the keyed flutes that came after the Baroque flute.